PowerShell. I've recently put in a new page for using PowerShell Core to manage SQL on Linux. Definitely invite people to check that out. And I'm searching for feedback on what other information is important to add to that page. So if you want to give that a look, and I'll drop this link in the chat in a minute. And then also, very important, great new editor experience is available in Azure Data Studio. The PowerShell extension is available there, and it just gives you all kinds of capabilities like tab completion. You can highlight a command and run it. You can get the syntax. You can get your parameter list so that you know what you need to add to your parameter for your function or your commandlet, and you get to see it in an editor where you can actually see changes happening to your databases as you're doing them. So definitely recommend folks check that out. And again, I'll drop a link to that in the chat here in just a second. And with all of that out of the way, I will now switch it over to Jess to talk about PowerShell and DSC.
All right, thank you. Can you see my slides okay?
Now we can.
All right, great. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. If you are with me on the East Coast, it is bright and early, so thanks for joining this morning. We're going to talk about desired state configuration, and usually at this point I say this is a PowerShell heavy session if I'm talking to kind of a SQL Server crowd, but since I've got the PowerShell crowd, hopefully that is appealing. As I said, my name is Jess Pomfret. I am a SQL Server DBA as my day job, and I'm also an open source contributor. That's actually how I got started on this journey of speaking and giving back a little bit. I was contributing to DBA tools and DBA checks, and just recently I actually contributed a resource to the SQL Server DSC module, which is pretty exciting. In my spare time, I CrossFit to keep in shape, and I enjoy proper football. I'm from the southwest of England originally, so still, although I'm living in Ohio, I still prefer proper football to the American kind. If you have any questions, feel free to tweet at me. I'm reasonably active on there, and my email address is at the bottom of every slide. If you feel like you want to drop me a line, that would be great. So this is the agenda for today, and we've really broken it up into two sections. The first section is what is desired state configuration. This is going to be a pretty good introduction to it if you've not heard about it, or if you're relatively new to it. That will be the majority of the session. The second half will be SQL Server and how to install and configure SQL Server using desired state configuration. Okay, so why do we want to use DSC? So DSC gives us this framework to enable infrastructure as code. As you can see on the slide, it's kind of like a pipeline. We're going to start off by the real main goal is on the left side of the slide, which is to get our infrastructure and our servers into source control. Once we have them in source control, we can go through this process of building them, testing them to make sure they're doing exactly what we want, and then automatically releasing them or deploying them. The main thing to focus on is that source control. If you can get step one down, that's a big chunk of, you're going to get a lot of benefits just by doing that. Now, it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around that to start with when you think about having physical machines, but as we're in this day and age, most of our machines are probably virtual. So if you think about the documents you use to build a virtual machine, that code can be stored in source control pretty easily. A few of the benefits of this infrastructure as code idea is, first of all, security. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen that cute little robot is going to deploy our servers. I don't need to have the same level of permissions that I once did to be able to build and deploy SQL servers, or really any servers, to be honest. It's also repeatable. I'm going to make the same kind of process. I'm going to make a change. I'm going to commit it into source control. I'm going to write some useful commit message, not just stuff or did work, and then I'm going to put it through this process. the second point right there is that since I added that commit message, it's now documented. Any change I make to my servers or my infrastructure, I can go back and see what date, who made the change, what the change was, and hopefully some explanation or link to an issue maybe. We can also take these servers and promote them through our environments, right? We can push it out into dev, and once we're happy, it can go to test environment, then it could become our production servers. We don't have to remember the exact steps I took each time and the checkboxes I checked or the settings, permissions I made. It makes it much more reliable. Now, obviously, this is an organizational culture thing. We can't go to work today and decide we're going to do infrastructure as code 100%. We need to find like a small project that we can use to kind of do a proof of concept or a demonstration and kind of reap some of the benefits before we can expand it. One thing to note here is if you're going to use this this format for your infrastructure, this pipeline needs to be extremely secure. You now have exactly how your environment was built in one place. If that is targeted for an attack or some kind of security issue, they basically have the keys to your kingdom at this point. So just one thing to make note of. Okay, so we know why we might want to use desired state. Let's talk about what it is. It was first released in Windows Management Framework 4.0, but it has been greatly enhanced with 5.1. So if you have the opportunity to use that, I would upgrade. I actually have the link in my slide deck that I'll share with you guys afterwards. Now it is PowerShell, but it is a domain-specific language. And what that means is it has its own domain of terminology and patterns. So some of it is feeling familiar and looks like PowerShell, and some of it looks a bit different. Another example of this is this domain-specific language is like Pesta. If you've ever written Pesta test, it's PowerShell, but it feels a little different. So with that language, we're going to create these configurations, and those configurations will manage the desired state of our infrastructure. And that's really the basic concept. We're going to write what we want it to look like in a configuration document using this PowerShell domain-specific language. It's also based on industry standards or open standards. The management object format is how the configuration documents end up being compiled. And then we also use that common information model to get information back and forth. So there's really 4 stages in DSC, and that's kind of how I'm going to walk through this presentation this morning. First, we're going to have to write our document or author it, describing the desired state of our infrastructure. We're then going to publish it or distribute it, push it out to our nodes, and where it will be enacted. The 4th stage is the monitoring stage. You can monitor whether you're still in desired state, and you can also use DSC to say, if you drift out of desired state, automatically put me back, which is powerful and something that is a little outside of the scope of this presentation. I'm going to concentrate this morning on the first 3 stages. Just know that the monitoring is available. Now, it looks like I have a question, but I don't see the question. Is that, maybe it's just a hand up.
You're good. Just keep going.
Okay. All right. Do you just want to do the questions at the end, or do you just want to interrupt me if there is one you want me to answer?
Shane and I will handle any like PowerShell specific questions that we know, and unless we get a bunch of questions, we'll keep going.
All right, perfect, thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the authoring stage. So when we start to look at writing DSC, there's a couple things I want to point out before we even start writing it. And one is that DSC is a declarative language. So the top portion of my screen, it is recognizable as a PowerShell script. It is imperative. I'm telling you exactly what you need to do, the instructions on how to do it. I'm saying I want to create a directory. It's a new item, there's the path, and it's of item type directory. If I run that, I'll create a directory, no problem. If I run it again though, I'm going to get a lot of errors, and that's something that you wouldn't get with DSC. The second portion of the screen, you can see I have the declarative DSC language for the same description. Instead of saying how to create the folder, I'm going to say I just want there to be a folder. I'm saying the destination path is ctemp, and I'm saying it should be present and of type directory. If I run that and it's not there, it'll be created. If I run that and it is there, it will not be created. There'll be no errors. You don't need to do error handling in your DSC scripts. That's handled under the covers within the engine. So we're really going to focus on describing our state instead of telling you how to do your job, how to do it. What I just mentioned is another concept with DSC, which is really cool. And that's DSC is idempotent. Now, it's always a good idea to put a word you can't say in your PowerPoint, especially when it's 7 o'clock in the morning. So I think I got through that. But this is the idea that you can execute that script multiple times without it changing the result. The desired state is always going to be, I want a folder on the C drive named temp to be present. If I run my DSC configuration and it's already there, it's going to leave it because it's already in the desired state. So this is really the idea of describing your desired state and then running the script, and it won't change. It'll always get to your desired state. It won't error out. Oh, okay. So resources. This is really one of the main building blocks. When we talk about writing our configurations, which we'll do in a second, we're going to use these resources to kind of target things we want to change. I'm going to jump into a demo and show you what I mean by that. Hopefully you can see my Visual Studio Code. So resources are packaged as modules. So this is going to look kind of familiar to you. I'm going to use this get DSC resource command to check out the PS Desired State Configuration module. Now that is a built-in module that comes with these resources already available to you. You can see the file resource. It's the one I was demoing in my slides, but there are other ones available for groups, packages, logs, services, registry if you want to change any registry keys, or Windows features, Windows services, etc. Now, one of the things I love about PowerShell is it wants to help you. You know, you have get help available and get command to kind of find things and get instructions. Get DSC resource acts pretty similarly, and if I choose the DSC resource file and I pass in the syntax parameter, you can see, hopefully, you can see that it returns exactly what I would need to use to write this. If I want to use this, I could copy this code out of my PowerShell, and it's a file resource. It tells me I need a resource name of a string type, and then these are all of the properties I can use to set up my desired state. The path, any attributes. I can choose the type down here, directory or file. So this makes it really easy to start learning DSC and finding the things you need to write your configurations. So I want to take a quick look at the other things available. If I look at this service resource and I just look at all the properties, you can see the parent path and the path here. It's a PSM1 file. It's, as I said, written as a module. So if I open that file real quick, you can see that within the resources, it's going to look a lot like PowerShell code. Now here at the top, I have some localization data, but if I come down, there are 3 main functions in each resource. A function to get the target, a function to test it, and a function to set it. And this is how the resources are idempotent. It uses that test function to see whether we're in the desired state, and if not, it passes it into the set function and it will set it. So this is where the instructions are. This is where I pass in, I say I want a file, I want it to be a directory. This is where it gets translated into actual PowerShell code to be executed. So the other thing is, if you can't, obviously there was only a few resources in that built-in module, but there are also resources in modules on the gallery. So for example, I want to know if there is a SQL setup resource out there for me to use. I can use find DSC resource. I'm passing in the name exactly, but you can filter on that. And I can see that there is a repository on the gallery. It's within the SQL Server DSC module, and it is SQL setup. If I could then download that module, install it onto my authoring machine, and also it needs to be available for my target machine. But then I can use these resources too. So let me pop back to my slides. So here's a few examples of different modules that are available. The one on the far left, the PS Desired State Configuration, is our built-in module. The one in the middle is that SQL Server module I mentioned. And then on the far right is X Active Directory. Now this is still a Microsoft module that has resources in, but the X means that it's experimental or it's still in development, basically. You can still use that, you just need to be a little more careful, test it a little more thoroughly. If you run find DSC resource and do a count on that, it gives me the number of all the resources in the gallery. And when I did that on the 1st of May, I got 1,400 resources. That's how many different things we can target with DSC and configure on our servers. One other thing to mention here is on the PS Desired State Configuration, you can see there are two that end in set. We have service set and Windows feature set. Now those are composite resources, which makes it easier for us to write our configuration. If I want to take an action on a Windows feature, perhaps I want to install it, I can use Windows feature set to install multiple at one time, and it is then translated when we compile it into the Windows feature resource. So it just is makes it easier to write, and there's a few of those available. Now, if we need a resource and we can't find one on the gallery or in our built-in module, we have a couple of options. First of all, we can use a script resource. And basically, I'm going to write my PowerShell as you saw in the resource example with a set and a test and a get function. If I can write that in PowerShell, I can use the script resource to basically run any PowerShell script. The same on SQL Server. There's a SQL script option if I want to do that with T-SQL. The other option is I can write my own module of DSC resources. If I have some stuff that is internal to my company, and it would be useful to have a DSC module for that, I could write a module that contains DSC resources and then use them in my configuration, the same as any I got from Microsoft or online. Okay, so we got our resources, which is our building block. We're going to take a look at writing our first configuration document. Now, this is a real simple one. You can see I've started off with this configuration command, and I've named it create SQL folders. This is the special type of command the special type of PowerShell function we were talking about. Within that, I can use this import DSC resource keyword. Now that can only be used within our configuration block, but that's how I bring in my modules with my resources. Underneath that, I have my node block. We can have one or more node blocks within our configuration document, but that is going to tell you the target. So right here, I'm trying to enact this configuration against server 1. I can have multiple node blocks with different servers, or I can have multiple servers passed in as an array to that node. Within that, I have my resource blocks. Now this is like building my desired state. So this first one is a file resource. I've named that create data dir, which has to be unique within that configuration document. And within that resource block, I use these properties to define the desired state. So the majority of this configuration document is going to be resources, right? Different files or different services I want to set, different features I want to install. But this is a real simple configuration that we can take and we can compile to be able to create, to be able to set a server into a desired state. So once we have our configuration, the next step is compiling it into this MOF file, which is one of those open standards. We take that configuration and compile it. We end up with one MOF per node. So if I compiled that example on the previous slide, I'd end up with one MOF for that server 1. It is one MOF per node except partial configurations, which I'm going to skip right over. There is a lot of talk on the internet. If you want to go read some good blog posts about it, it is tricky. It is a really great concept, but it seems a little difficult to implement. So for right now, just know that there's one MOF per node. Now, the third thing is this MOF file will be modified and reapplied. It won't be changed completely. If you wanted to add something, you would make incremental changes and then recompile the MOF file. So let's take a look at creating a simple configuration. All right, so here is my simple configuration. It looks a lot similar. It looks very similar to my slide example. I have importing my DSC resources, and then I have my nodes. I'm enacting against 2 servers, and I have 2 resource blocks, one for the data directory and one for the log directory. When I run this, it just returns nothing. But if I check this get command and look for the configuration type, you can see that I've created this command that I can now use called create SQL folder. So there are some common parameters on this, one of them being output, which is where I want my MOF files to go. So I'm going to run that, telling it I want to go to the output folder. And you can see I have 2 MOF files generated. If I take a quick look at this DSC Server 2 MOF file, you can see it is not as easy to read. You can edit this file if you need to, but it's easier to do it through the configuration. But here you can see is my name, my create data, and then my destination path is right here. There's another one for the log directory. Okay, so that was pretty easy. That's how we create our MOF files. We're now ready to use those MOF files to enact our desired state on a target node. But let's pop back. We can make this a little better using configuration data. So configuration data is what we're probably going to use in the real world. We want to separate the data from the configuration. And when I say data, I mean like server names, folder paths, stuff that might be different on each server or within each environment. This allows us to use the same configuration document for different environments or different servers, but then just changing the data that we pass into it. So this configuration data is a common parameter on any configuration function or command, and we're going to pass in a hash table. You can see an example in the bottom right-hand corner. It has to have an all nodes key, but then you can also include non-node data or any extra data you want to pass in. This configuration data can also be a separate PSD1 file, which is real useful if you're going to put it into source control, because then if you're only making changes to the data, you don't have to touch your configuration document. So let's go back and look at how we can enhance that. Where is the, here we go. Okay, so this is my configuration, the same one we looked at previously, but using configuration data. You can see I'm using this all nodes keyword, which comes from the configuration data that I'll show you in a second. And I'm saying for any node in that array, I'm going to create these directories. This is the non-node data. I'm pulling in the paths I want to use for my data directory and my log directory. And then finally, I have a second node block. For this one, I'm using the where method on this all nodes array, and I'm saying if the environment is test, I want to also create a test directory. So now I can use this configuration, and depending on whether I pass in the information for a test server or a production server, it's going to come out looking slightly different. So let me run this real quick to create that function. Let me show you the configuration data. Now this is all I have right now. I have DSC server 1, it is a test server, and then I have my 3 paths or my file locations in my non-node data section. So you can see the output file is empty at the moment. If I run this and I'm passing in the configuration data that I just showed you, you can see 1 MOF file was created because that was all I defined within my configuration data. So if we take a quick look at that, you can see I have my data directory here. I have my log directory here. And then I have my test directory because I defined this as a test server. If I come back and I'm ready to go to production, I can copy this. I can add a second item to this array, and I'm going to have a second server. We're ready to go to production. I'll save this configuration data. Now I'm not changing my configuration that I already executed. I'm just going to rerun this create SQL folder. And you can see that I now get 2 MOF files. That's how easy it was to add a second server. And since I defined it as production, we can check it out. There is a create data directory, there's a create log directory, and that is the end of the file. Because I defined it in my configuration data as a production server, the test section of that configuration was not applied. I can also change these folders. If I wanted to change all of the folders, I'm going to install 2016 instead. I can change them in the configuration document, rerun this to generate my MOF files. If I have a look, they've now changed to 2016. So this is a pretty easy way to separate the real meat of our configuration with the data that could change reasonably often. All right. So that's how we author our configuration. That's how we're going to write our configuration documents and design and describe our desired state. The next step is publishing them. So there are two modes of DSC, and I'm only going to talk about the push mode for today. And that is where we will take that MOF file that we generated, push it out to our target node, and then apply it on the node. The other option is the pull mode, which is probably more appropriate for an enterprise model. That is where you would put your configurations and your modules that are needed, your resources that are needed on a central pull server, and then your target nodes will be registered with that pull server and will check in on a certain frequency. You can use a local server with a pull service or an SMB share setup on it, or you can use Azure Automation for your pull server. With Azure Automation, it's obviously in the cloud, but you can register on-premise machines with that. Now, we have two options for pushing out our configurations. We can use the Start-DscConfiguration function, which will deliver our configuration to the node and then enact it immediately. So it will be pushed out and then ran straight away. We can also use Publish-DscConfiguration if we want to push out our configuration but not apply it immediately. We'll talk about how they get enacted in a second, but for this example, we're going to use Start-DscConfiguration because we want it to happen immediately. So our MOF files, we've generated them, we wrote our configuration, we compiled them to a MOF file, and we published them. We pushed them out to our target node. So it's time to make it so in the enact phase. So this is where we want to talk about the local configuration manager. Okay, this is really the engine of DSC, and there is a local configuration manager on every target node, which will pass the MOF file and enact it. This is where you would determine whether you're in push or pull mode. And when we set up our local configuration manager, we would use actually very similar to the configurations we've already written, but it's called a meta configuration. And that is how we would define whether our desired state of our LCM is push mode or pull mode. There are many settings available for the LCM. Here's just a few, and I won't go through these today. I've put notes for all of these in the slide deck if you want to go through, or there's a link to the books online which has all of them. You can see refresh mode is there. Refresh frequency minutes is how often it would check in. If we're in pull mode and I set that to 20 minutes, every 20 minutes my node is going to check in and see if there's anything new to pull down. If a new configuration is out, it will pull it down and then make itself into that desired state. The reboot node, if needed, is one to keep an eye on. If I set that to true and I push out a configuration that creates a pending reboot, my node is going to restart automatically. That's probably fine while I'm building a server, but probably not if it's already in production and I'm making a change that maybe I don't realize it's going to cause that pending reboot. Just something to keep an eye on. So let's take a look at our LCM and how we'd configure that. Okay, first off, let's take a look at, I have a virtual machine running DSC Server 2. Let's have a look. You can see there's a lot of settings available on the LCM. I'm going to narrow this down to just the three I care about right now, which is the action after reboot. So if I reboot, I want my configuration to continue enacting. My refresh mode is push, which is the default, and currently my configuration mode frequency minutes is 15. That third setting is how often, if I push out a configuration and don't enact it immediately, how often would it be enacted? So if I pushed it out and it's 15 minutes, within 15 minutes, my server will get to the desired state. So here is my configuration to set my LCM. You should notice that it looks very similar to what we've already been writing. The only difference is this DSC local configuration manager. And I have this settings block right here. You can see I've changed this from the default of 15. I'm going to change it to 20. And I'm going to do this the exact same way we did with our file examples. I'm going to run that to create the configuration. I named it LCM config, so I'm going to run that. And you can see that I now have another MOF file. Now this is a meta MOF file because it's a meta configuration for our LCM. To apply the configuration, I need to use set DSC local configuration manager. I'm going to point it to that path and say that I want to set it on DSC Server 2. I'm using the verbose keyword here, or switch to, so I get some output back on the screen. Otherwise, it would just come back and it will be done. We'll talk a little bit more about the output in a second, but let's just check it out. Okay, we've changed this to 20 minutes. So that's how we set our configuration frequency minutes, but we would do that the same way if we wanted to change it to pull. We would set up all of the things we need for a pull server and push it out that way. All right, so the fourth step, once we've got our servers in the desired state, is to monitor them. Now, this is something that DSC has available, and we're not going to spend too much time talking about it, but there are other tools that are available that do perhaps a more complete job of monitoring. So something to be aware of. But here's a few of the commands we can use to kind of keep an eye on our nodes. The first one will tell us the current configuration of the node. It won't tell us whether it's in the desired state. It is just going to tell us the configuration that we sent out to it. The second, get DSC configuration status, will tell us the status for all of our configuration runs, whether they were successful or whether they failed. The third one, test DSC configuration, will return true or false if my node is in desired state or out of desired state. If I use the verbose switch on that, it will tell you where it failed or where it was not in the desired state. But something to note is that it will stop at the first failure. So if there are multiple resources that are not in the desired state, you'll only see the first one. Another thing with DSC you want to take note of is the event logs. So the first two, operational and admin, are enabled by default. An analytic and debug you can turn on if you need. One of the downsides of DSC is that it is reasonably difficult to troubleshoot. So these event logs will be your friend if you have a configuration that fails or something's not right. This is where you're going to want to look. So that is DSC. That is our introduction to DSC. I don't know if there are any questions right now that we want to take, or if anyone has questions on just the DSC portion.
Sure. The question we have real quick is, which stage did you say you were going to want to put it into source control?
So those the configuration document and the configuration data is what we're going to want to put in source control. When we compile it and create that MOF, it's probably going to be classed as an artifact and will be used in our pipeline, but the raw documents are what we're going to want to store. And then any changes we make to those will have to be documented, right? I'll make a change to add a file or add a folder to my server. I have to put a commit message in my source control to say why I did that.
All right. I'll let you go on with the next step.
All right, great. So now we're moving on to the DSC and SQL Server section. Now, as I said, I'm a SQL Server DBA, so one of the things I do reasonably often is install SQL Server. So I have this checklist. This is the things I'm going to do when someone comes to me and says, I need a new SQL Server. So I'm going to install Windows features, perhaps .NET Framework, depending on the version. I'm going to create my directories for my install files, my data, my logs, my tempdb. Then I'm going to install SQL Server. I'm going to set up TCP/IP and the Windows firewall so I can connect remotely. And then I have a few server configuration options that I'm going to want to set. I just picked out a few for this demo. There's many things you could do at this point that you could write in DSC. I'm going to try and keep it relatively simple. So then the seventh step is to create a database. I create this DBA database for my maintenance scripts and for my DBA stuff. So this checklist is kind of long, and if I'm going to do this manually, it's going to take quite a while. And with the movement of DevOps and kind of continuous development and integration, stuff needs to happen quicker than I can move through this checklist. So I'm going to take this checklist and I'm going to translate it into DSC modules and resources that I want to use. So as you can see, I've got my Windows feature and my file resource from my built-in module. I'm also going to use the SQL Server DSC module for my install and my TCP/IP and my firewall. One thing to note on the firewall, there are actually two options here. I can either use the SQL Server DSC module, or there is a networking DSC module and a firewall resource. So the firewall resource gives you a lot more flexibility for naming the kind of rule you want to set up. Can be used for things other than SQL Server. The SQL Windows firewall resource does just firewall rules for SQL Server. So if that's what you want, it's easier to use, but if you need more flexibility, there's another option. You can see there's even a resource for creating my database, SQL database, to just create a database on the server. All right, so let's do it. Let's install a SQL Server. Okay. So this is my configuration document. You can see it's a lot longer than the sample ones we were working with. I'm going to prove to you that the DSC Server 2, there are no SQL services running right now. There is no SQL Server installed on my target node currently. So I'm going to run this whole document because it takes a little while to run, and then we'll talk through it. You can see I'm being prompted for my user password, for my SA password. So I'm going to type something super secure right here. And it's going to start. Okay, my MOFs were generated, and now it's going to execute that one against DSC Server 2. So it's going to run through the first few pretty quickly until it gets to the install step. Right here is where it's actually installing SQL Server. So first off, let's take a look at the MOF file. We're enacting it on Server 2, so I'm going to show you that one. You can see it's pretty long, but some of it looks pretty similar, right? Here's my install directory, the path, the instance directory, and a path. I'm going to show you something here. Here's my super secure password in clear text within my MOF file. Now, I had to tell DSC I wanted to do this because it's just for a sample. But if you do not encrypt your MOF files with a certificate, a document encryption certificate, and there's more information on Books Online for that, your passwords and your credentials will be in clear text in your MOF file. And so on my authoring station, perhaps in my source control, if I probably wouldn't put this in source control. And then on my target node, it's also stored in clear text, which is a security risk. So just one thing to note there. In real life, we would encrypt our MOF files and they would be encrypted and unable to be read. So let's take a quick look at our configuration file. It's not too complicated. I have my all nodes key with my servers. I have a test server and this server 2, which is production, which is the one we're building right now. This node name of asterisk means that this section will apply to all nodes. And this is where I had to tell it that I was okay with using plain text passwords. So DSC does have some built-in help for you. It's not just going to let you do plain text passwords without you having to acknowledge it. I then have my non-node data, and I have this set up in two ways. My files I have just as just listed here, each one as a key. And then my config options I had actually as an array, and I'll show you why I did these two differently just to give you options. You can see here's the settings. The name is backup compression. I'm going to turn it on by setting it to 1. So let's take a quick look at our install configuration document. So here's my all nodes, right? So I'm going to run, this node is going to be for any node, and all of these resources will apply. I've commented out the Windows feature install of .NET just because it takes a little time. And I wanted to make sure this demo fit into my hour session. Here's my creating my directories. Now, the first way I showed you, I would have to go through and create a resource for each one of these. So if I wanted to add a folder, I would need to come in and touch my configuration document to add this folder. I then have my install. Now, this is the settings that I would set if I was doing it through the GUI, right? I'm setting the security mode to SQL, which is mixed mode authentication. I'm setting up a sysadmin account. This is the path to the install media. Here's the features. I've only chosen the SQL engine for this one, and my instance name is MS SQL Server, or the default instance. Here are the data log install directories that I want to use for my install. Moving on, you can see I've enabled TCP/IP. I've used the SQL Windows firewall to set up a firewall rule for my SQL Server. And here is the second way that I'm using configuration data. I'm using my non-node data, my config options, and for each item in that config options array, I'm going to build a resource. So I'm using PowerShell, like the imperative PowerShell we know, to loop through these config options and build these resources out. So I've named them set config option with whatever the option name is. I want them, then I have the option name coming from the array and the setting. So if I wanted to add another setting, I could do that to the array and not have to touch my configuration document. So it's just kind of a design thought when you're setting up your documents and your configuration data, you just kind of want to think about how we want to make changes, basically. You can see finally I have my create DBA database. I've given it a name. For most of the other settings on the database is another resource. So like if I want to set the owner or the recovery mode, there is a resource for that. I will point out this depends on. In WMF 4.0, the order of this document didn't matter. The compilation of the MOF file and then the execution of it, it could happen in any order. So you needed to make sure you use this depends on to say that when I create my DBA database, the SQL Server should be installed. So this is the resource type and then the name I gave it from earlier on in the document. There's also a built-in property called PS-DSC run as credential that can be used on all of these resources to run as a different user. By default, DSC runs as the system account, so it might not have permissions to say use the registry keys or file shares, stuff like that. I already mentioned that the SA password was in plain text in our MOF file if we didn't encrypt it. I just wanted to make that clear again. So while this is still running, let's take a look at what we get here. It's not happy. There we go. Okay, so this is not super easy to read on this screen, but you can see the DSC Server 2 is the server I'm enacting. And then here I have the SQL setup install SQL. So that is the resource that is actually running right now. You can see that it actually just finished, so it's going to finish up the configuration and then we'll talk through it. So I've used the verbose switch on this Start-DsC configuration so that I get this yellow output back. I'm also using the wait switch. If you don't use wait, it runs as a background job and you don't see any of this coming back to your session. So if you're doing it for this kind of purpose and I want to see what's happening, you want to use the wait and the verbose switch. All right, so there's my configuration options. It's changing those. And there's my create DBA database. All right, it's complete. It took 6 minutes and 44 seconds to complete my entire checklist. And let's go over to Azure Data Studio and connect, make sure it looks good. Maybe. All right, it's green. If I check out my databases, there's my DBA database. And if I look at SP configure, I can see that cost threshold for parallelism. It's currently set at 25. That's what I defined in my configuration data, and that's my server is now in my desired state. So what happens if I want to make a change? Now I said that this we would make incremental changes. So, and where we make those changes depends on how we designed our files. So if I want to add another database, I would need to add another resource. So I could take this resource, I just copied it, I pasted it in. I'm going to make you a PowerShell database because you want to do some PowerShell that's going to end up as data in my database. I've changed the name. I made sure to change this resource name. This has to be unique within our documents. So I'm going to save that. I read online, that it is a really good idea to change this to 500. So I'm going to make that configuration change. And when I save it, I'm going to have to put a commit message into my source control, right? I'm going to put, I read this online and I think it's a great idea. Spoiler alert, it's not a great idea. You shouldn't believe everything you read online. But for this example, I'm going to change that to 500 just so we can see it. So I've made a small change to my configuration data and a small change to my configuration document. I'm going to rerun this whole file. It's going to ask for my password again, just because of how I have it set up. So I'm going to put that in. And now it's going to go through and it is going to use the test functionality of each of those resources to see whether I'm in the desired state. And if I'm not, it is going to set me to the desired state. So when it gets to the folders that have already been created or the SQL Server install that's already happened, it's going to return as true as in the desired state and then basically skip the set section. When it gets to the two things that are not in the desired state, it's going to change them. And you can see that pretty well here. So here is my let's go to DBA. Here's my create DBA database. This is the start of that resource. and then it goes straight into the test section. It says checking if database name DBA is present. Down here it says it is present, so it then skips the set section. Hopefully that makes sense. The second database it comes to, it starts this resource for the create POSH database. It's checking if database POSH is present or absent. It says it's absent, but ensure it's set to present, so it should be created. It finishes the test section and moves into the set section, where basically it's creating this database POSH. Okay, so because I made incremental changes to my document and then reset it, it only took 28 seconds to make those changes, right? It didn't reinstall SQL. It didn't do any of the things that were already in the desired state. I can come back over to Azure Data Studio and check my databases. You can see that was created. And if I check this, you can see it's been changed to 500. Again, 500 is probably not a great value for this, but just as an example. So that's how we'd make a change to our SQL Server. We were going to make those incremental changes. We're going to check them into source control, and I'm going to write a good commit message. Now, when one of my colleagues comes in and says, oh, why do we have this POSH database? They can go back to source control and see the documentation on who added it, when it was added, and why. So that's pretty powerful. Okay, so next steps. This slide is really a, I'm interested in DSC, where should I go next slide? And I've broken it into 3 sections. So the first section is our source control and CI pipeline. This, if you're going to use DSC, you might as well use some kind of source control, maybe Git, some kind of GitHub or Git version on a machine somewhere local. Check these in, keep them safe. You now have a great resource if you have a disaster and you need to rebuild servers, or you need to see when something changed, why it changed. The CI pipeline is really the next step to that, building in your automated testing, your automated deployment. The middle section, I've listed Chef, Puppet, and Ansible. These are some other options to DSC. They're all configuration management tools. Some of them integrate with DSC. Some of them do things a little differently, but something to look at. The third section on this screen is some things I found that work with DSC that are pretty interesting. So the first one, Datum, is a PowerShell module. It's on GitHub, and it's an interesting way of writing your configuration data in. Starting to look at that currently for how we could build SQL servers. Basically, I would have some environment files, some SQL Server type files perhaps, and then I would have a node file. And depending on how I define my node, it would pick up configuration document or configuration data from the other levels of the hierarchy, the environment, the type, etc. Azure Automation is that Azure service. They have the pull service available, and you can register your nodes with that, which is probably a good way of managing a pull service if that's the way you want to go. The last thing I've mentioned here is reverse DSC. This is pretty green and so needs some work probably still, but the idea is we're going to point reverse DSC at a current node, and it is going to create the configuration document for how it's currently configured. So that will be a great way, if you already have servers built, to get them into this infrastructure as code kind of setup. So these are just some things to think about or to look at if you want to take the next steps after basically creating simple DSC configurations. So I've made it to the end. We're under an hour, so I must have talked really fast. So apologies if it's hard to understand. But if you have any questions, my email address is on the screen, my Twitter handle. I've also listed my website. I've been trying to do some DSC blog posts, and I have probably 3 or 4 out there on different sections right now. This slide deck and all of the demos I did today are available on my jpomfret demos repo on GitHub. So if you want to download them and play, feel free.
All right. We've got.
There's also.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to also mention the SQL Server DSC module. If you go to their GitHub, they have tons of great examples on how to use it, including how to set up always on, which is pretty cool. But yeah, go ahead. Do we have questions?
Oh, yes.
Oh, man. All right.
Don't worry. Half of them are asking for your code or asking if the session is recorded. Let's get the ones that don't ask about that. Do you personally find monitoring for configuration drift and automatically enacting changes, pull mode, more useful or dangerous?
That's a great question. So in theory, I think it would be super useful, but it scares me a lot. So monitoring, I'm going to take that in two parts. The monitoring will be really useful. I have a lot of SQL servers that we install vendor apps on, and some of them make changes that I want to know about. So if I had set up a server and then monitored for change and was alerted on that change, that would be useful to me. What would be scary is if I had it set to automatically go back to my configuration, which would not be so useful if my vendor app set it a certain way for their app, right? In real life, I feel like using the automatic correction is probably not very useful, but I guess it really depends on your infrastructure and how you have stuff set up, right? If the change should be made in your configuration and in your source control, then maybe that's okay to set it to automatically correct, because any changes should be made and gone through that pipeline. Personally, I think I'm going to struggle to ever get to that point, and I'm probably going to use the alerting and then kind of follow up personally on whether we can set it back. But good question.
Right. Let's see. How often does DSC require a reboot to complete?
It only requires a reboot if you make a change that would cause a pending reboot. So one of the examples is if you're installing Windows features. After I install Windows feature, the SQL Server install quite often requires a reboot. So at that point, it would restart. If I had that setting to automatically restart, it would restart and continue on. It really depends. If you were using it to do Windows updates or something like that, I can imagine quite often it would want to reboot. But if you're creating folders or setting services and stuff, not so much probably.
All right. There's a question on how to find the property names and values to be used in a configuration.
Okay, so depending on the module, one of the easiest ways would be to go to GitHub and look at the documentation. So like SQL Server DSC has all of the properties and then examples on how to use them. But if you're within PowerShell, in one of my earlier slides, we had that get DSC resource. You can use the syntax switch to output the syntax for that resource, and that's all of the properties available.
All right. Can you attach or restore databases here too?
Good question. I don't think you can. No, I think the SQL database resource is just for new databases, but you could use the SQL script resource or the script resource, which would be a PowerShell script, to kind of write something yourself, perhaps to restore from a certain location. If it was like if we're thinking DevOps and we want to spin up an environment for something and we wanted to restore a certain database, we could write that as a SQL script, and it would maybe test if the database is there, and if not, in the set stage, it would restore it.
Well, if we've
one option.
But you said we also have PowerShell available, right?
Yeah, PowerShell script. Yep.
Wonderful.
Which is just in the built-in module. So a PowerShell script using DBA tools perhaps would work pretty well there.
Actually, during the last update to the SQL Server module, they added a relocate files attribute to the restore SQL database command. So now it'll relocate your your data files, your log files, all that kind of stuff to your directory without anyone having to go in there and hand jam all that stuff. So
awesome. So that would make it a lot simpler too to write a PowerShell script. Nice.
Deal. Let's see. Would you use DSC to install SQL on an Azure VM?
Good question. Yeah, you could. I imagine you could. It would have to be a VM, right? Not an Azure SQL database or anything. But yeah, you could configure that VM using DSC to install SQL Server for sure.
And then the question goes on to use. Would you use a VM template, or would you use a VM template and run the DSC for configuration only? And I'm thinking immediately of I remember, in situations where I needed to clone my QA environment that I would feel safer, probably with DSC in this case if I was already using it. But What do you think, Jess?
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about the templates or how many options you have available, so I'm probably not an expert on that. But yeah, DSC gives you a great way of defining exactly what you want it to look like, and then you can basically rely on that, right? You know you're going to get the same desired state every time you set up a new box. So.
All right. Are Microsoft patches handled by DSC or independently?
There is a Windows Update DSC resource or DSC module of resources. I haven't looked into it too much, but I know it is out there, so you could probably look into that if you were interested. But
here's a great question, or at least having done similar things, I feel like this is a great question. What's the best approach to get the SQL install files available for the config?
Sure. So on my simple example today, I had already pushed it out to the target node just so that it was available. But a better way would to have a file share or something that's accessible from all your target nodes. If you were going to use a pull server, you could have a spot on there that was a share that was available. Do you say you did it, or you were thinking about it?
Oh, I was doing Docker installation a few weeks ago, and I realized that if I'm going to show people how to do this, one of the things to make it easier and quicker for them to get up and running was to actually show them how to quickly pull down the installer files. Because
Gotcha.
your installer files would need to look just like mine in order to complete the demo. And if you did some steps differently, you might have installer files, but they might not be in the right spot or, organization.
Gotcha. Okay.
Structure. So,
cool.
Great questions coming. Keep them coming, people. As long as you have some more time, we're over the time, Jess, but if you have time, we'll keep going with questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, perfect. A little bit of almost a question fragment, but maybe it makes sense. What to change in config file to uninstall SQL?
Oh, great question. So currently the SQL setup DSC resource doesn't handle uninstalling SQL Server. So I had to use I had to resort back to using the SQL setup command line with the switches to uninstall. I was just pulling that up. You can see in my demos switch, I'm using this action uninstall, but there is an issue out there on GitHub, and as I mentioned, the SQL Server DSC module is open source and on GitHub. So if someone is feeling inspired, they could go take that issue and help make this better by allowing you to uninstall features. So, great question.
So speaking of GitHub, I think you may have already answered this question before and mentioned GitHub, but let's see. Can this be used for always on setup as well?
Yes, it can. And there's a great example on the SQL Server DSC repo of how to use that for always on. Yep.
Next question, how to use a defined instance name in the create directory section. I think they're thinking of like do a named instance, and then they also want the corresponding folder name to correspond to that exact name of the instance that they gave.
So I'm guessing you would set your instance name in your SQL setup resource, and then your folders can be called whatever you wanted. So you could use some PowerShell to use that like variables or whatever to build that string if you wanted.
Yep, totally agree. And use join path when doing that stuff to make sure you get it right.
Yeah.
Nothing like realizing that somehow you had a space in there and it messes everything up. Let's see. What about updating SQL Server like a service pack or CU? Does DSC offer anything there, or the definition or anything like that?
That's a great question. So I know when you do the SQL setup, you can point it to your install file, and you can also point it to an update folder. So if I install 2017 now, I could make sure I have my latest CUs and pull those into the install. I'm not sure whether there's an update, to be honest. But if there is, it would be on GitHub. So you could check that out.
That's a great question. I also know of another effort in that area, so I'm going to make sure that the dots get connected there. Nothing to share on that right now, unfortunately. Sorry, these are jumping. Let's go to a short question. Do we need to have authoring server and installation server separate?
No, you don't have to. You could use the same server if you wanted to. Just probably for enterprise, you would want them separate so that you didn't have to log on to every server. But I could have set up my machine I was on and installed SQL Server right there. So the authoring server could also be your desktop, right? And if I author it on my desktop and I check it into source control and it goes off through that pipeline to install, that's another option.
Beautiful. Could the better credentials modules be used instead of encrypting the MOF file to keep the passwords secure? I'm not familiar with that one. Are you?
I am not. I will say that any credential that you pass in to DSC, it ends up in plain text in your MOF file. Like if you use, you can also use your domain account that you'll write in the file in, that will end up in plain text in your MOF if it's not encrypted. So.
Gotcha. All right. Let's see. Does a script resource only run when a given test condition is met? Say I wanted to ensure the volume indexing at the OS level was disabled, for example. It seems you indicated a pattern of get test set.
Yeah, so you would write that test function to return true or false based on whether your condition was met. You can use variables and parameters to do that if you want to pass in like what the conditions are, but your test needs to just return true or false. And then if it is false, your set would handle that and enact it. So the error handling and all the kind of working out whether you're in the desired state in your set would happen in your test, if that makes sense.
Got it. I think it does. All right, and we have finally made it down to the end of the questions. Thank you so much for
some good ones. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is it for our session today, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, Azure Data Studio now has a PowerShell extension that is the same PowerShell extension that is available in VS Code. Definitely recommend folks check that out, give that a try, and see if you like it. It is now going to be updated every time that the Visual Studio Code extension gets updated. The one in Azure Data Factory will still will get updated at the same time and show up in the marketplace within a few hours of the same time. So definitely recommend folks give that a whirl. Can make reduce context switching when you're working with SQL Server and working with PowerShell scripts. So that is it. Thank you so much for doing this for us, Jess. Really appreciate it. Really excited to get this information out to people, and we'll get it posted to YouTube as soon as we can.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.